Good morning, Spelman sisters and guests. I am Allison Shumpert Dorsey, class of 2002, and I serve as Associate Director in the Office of Alumni Engagement. And I am welcoming you to this homecoming Stronger Together, a Forever Sisterhood activity for today. So this morning we have the honor of welcoming our very own Dr. Jayne Morgan, class of 84, as she debunks myths of surrounding COVID-19. This is an honest and transparent conversation with Dr. Morgan and will help deconstruct and debunk some complexities around COVID-19 itself, as well as the vaccine. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. During the session, there'll also be some polls for you to answer. And we just thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Morgan.
Thank you so much, Allison. And wow, I'm glad to be here with all of my Spelman sisters this morning. So I know we have been in a long pandemic, right? It's been about a year and a half. And we have a lot of questions. There have been a lot of changes. We're in our fourth surge. And so I think it's really timely as we kind of move into our homecoming celebrations to take a look at where we are with this surge. So I am going to share my screen. And let's see. So I guess I'm not going to share my screen. My slides are not here. Okay. I don't see them. So let me see if I can just pull them up another way. All right. So looks as if I'm going to pull up my slides here. All right, let's see if I can bring them up now. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see them now. I just pulled up a second set of them. I don't know where the original ones were, but here we are when we are within our COVID pandemic here, October 13th, 2022. And so I thought it was a good time really just to take a review of where we've been in this pandemic. And one of the questions that I often get is, I'm really concerned about taking this vaccine because it was developed just so quickly. How can I trust it? And so when we take a look at this SARS-CoV-2 virus, this severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, so named because this is the second time that we've seen it. So when was the first time that we saw it? We saw it initially in 2003 with the very first outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome. You may or may not have remembered that because at the time, our global pandemic surveillance teams were intact and in place, and we were able to keep that outbreak outside of the United States. But in the scientific community, alarm bells were going off everywhere. Why? Because this is a virus. And what do viruses do? Viruses replicate and mutate very quickly. That's their characteristic. It's also a respiratory virus. It's spread by aerosolization. That's very concerning for Homo sapiens, which we all are. We are Homo sapiens, human beings who live on a single planet in our galaxy called Earth. On Earth, as Homo sapiens, we require air. Here we have a virus that is transmitted by air. And so that's a concern. So in 2003, scientists were very concerned about this. In 2012, we had a second outbreak, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, the MERS outbreak. Is a sister family of coronaviruses. So by 2012, we have had 2 warning shots fired and alarms are going off throughout the scientific community. Lots of concern about a pandemic that surely will come if we cannot get on top of this. In 2020, by the time that we had our very first case of COVID here in the United States, 17 years of research had been completed. And when I say 17 years of research, I mean all of the preclinical work was done, all of the bench work research had been completed, the identification and analysis of the genomic sequence of this virus, all 30,000 base pairs had been identified and analyzed, and the mechanism of action, the mode via which this virus infects our bodies, that spike protein that you hear about, that binds to the angiotensin converting enzyme receptors of our cells, had already been identified and elucidated. We had not even had our very first case of COVID. 17 years of research with the scientific community recognizing 2 warning shots had been fired from the pistol in 2003 and 2012, that we needed to prepare for what surely would come as this coronavirus family continue to evolve. So the other thing to think about with regard to how quickly this was developed is when you're developing vaccines or drugs, by and large, at a very high level, they're developed in 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is usually what we call a healthy phase, a safety phase, where we really are only looking at safety data. And so we gather that data on people who enroll. And then after that phase closes, we look at the data. And if the data is positive, we get the green light to go to phase 2. And we start the whole process over again with even more people. It's a very slow, it's a very cumbersome process. The reason for that is that it costs almost $1 billion to bring a drug or a vaccine to the market to full commercialization. So a company, certainly the CEO and the board of that company, wants to be certain that the data that is coming through these early phases of development is actually good data. We call this killing it quickly, killing it early. If the data is negative, we want to kill that compound early before millions and millions of dollars are invested in it. So it's a slow process. All of the data is examined after phase 1, and then all of the data is examined after phase 2. But what happened in this pandemic when this began? We developed unlimited resources. Unlimited resources began to pour in to these vaccine companies. And by resources, I mean money. This Operation Warp Speed, the United States government. If you have unlimited resources, you can actually do a lot of things. One of the things that can be done is you can de-risk this process. So instead of doing the phases in tandem, they stacked them on top of one another. And so phase 2 started before phase 1 ended. Phase 3 started before phase 2 ended. The data was coming in real time, and you really never got a chance to see all of the data until the very end. Without these resources, no company would have ever taken that risk. Because if you're not looking at your data until the end and the data is actually negative, then you just lost $1 billion. So no company would take that risk. But if there are unlimited resources and the funds are not yours, you're risking someone else's money, then we're able to stack those phases. And so we saw these vaccines then develop very, very, very quickly. And then the last thing that we know is we had emergency use authorization. Now we know Pfizer is FDA approved. Under emergency use authorization, these vaccines and any drug and any device can come to the market more quickly. So what's the difference between EUA and FDA? All of the safety data is the same, all of it. That is a term that is not commonly used in science, all and never. We rarely use those terms. If you see those in exams, it's probably not the right answer. But in this particular case, all of the safety data is still required for emergency use authorization and FDA approval. All of the regulatory data is also, that efficacy data is also required. So what's the difference? The immunity data or that durability data is different. For full FDA approval, we need 6 to 8 months, sometimes out to a year of immunity data for approval. Emergency use authorization only required 60 days. So what that meant was we knew the vaccines were safe. We knew they were efficacious, meaning we knew they worked, but we didn't know how long they were going to work. That immunity data, that durability data. At the time of emergency use authorization, we only knew that they would work for 60 days. That was the data that we had. How do we meet that requirement? The two major requirements for emergency use authorization: human life has to be at risk, and we have to have no other available therapies, alternatives, or therapeutics available to human beings here in the United States. So human life is at risk, and we don't have any options. And there's a pandemic coming. If you meet that criteria, then you qualify for emergency use authorization. And that is what we saw here. So that is why it appears that things were developed so quickly. But in actuality, there had been almost 2 decades of work on this coronavirus family. We stacked all of those phases when unlimited resources became available, and emergency use authorization also shortened the process by almost a year. The other question that I often get is about pregnancy and fertility. I am concerned about taking these vaccines because I want to start a family, or I have not had my family yet, or I'm pregnant now and I do not want to risk my baby. So what do we know about pregnancy and fertility? If we look at the Moderna trial, 30,000 people were enrolled in that trial. If we look at the Pfizer trial, 40,000 people were enrolled there. We look at the Johnson & Johnson trial, 42,000 people. That's a lot of people, 112,000 people enrolled in these trials. Pregnant women were excluded from these trials. And not only were they excluded, women who were enrolled in these trials were also asked to sign an attestation stating that for the duration of this trial, they also would not become pregnant. But this is the United States of America. What do you think happened? You think everybody followed the rules? So Moderna ended up with 23 women pregnant in the trial. Pfizer ended up with 13 women who became pregnant during the course of this trial. And Johnson & Johnson had 8 women who became pregnant during the course of this trial. We call these unintended pregnancies. They're not unintended by the women. They're unintended by the companies. The companies did not intend for them to happen and did everything that they could to prevent it. They excluded pregnant women. They made women sign a form stating that they would not get pregnant. We call these unintended pregnancies. What this did, however, was give us a nice little cohort of 44 pregnant women, all of whom had been immunized and all of whom had become pregnant since immunization to follow. And now we've followed all of those pregnancies all the way out to delivery, all normal gestations, normal pregnancies. Mothers are doing well. Babies are healthy, except one person who had a spontaneous abortion. When we unblinded that patient, blinding is a scientific term. And so just at a high level, you have 2 groups. One group in the trial is receiving the real vaccine. The other group in the trial is receiving a dummy vaccine. Nobody knows which is which. You don't know which group you were in. And if it's double blinded, even the physician who gave you the vaccine doesn't know. The vaccine is not marked. It will simply have a code on it, like a QR code. And the solutions are identical. So that's called blinding. And those are the highest levels of scientific integrity, because it decreases the opportunity to introduce bias. Nobody knows who is getting what. So we call this unblinding when it's sort of like going to the Oscars. You rip open the envelope and you announce the winner. So we unblind the patient, meaning we break the code. And it turns out that that single patient who had the spontaneous abortion was actually in the placebo group, in the group that didn't receive the real vaccine. So what else do we know about pregnancy and these vaccines? When you go to the get your vaccine, you are asked to register with a VSafe app. V as in Victor. When you download this app, you can put anything that you would like into that app. Whatever you think is a side effect or something that you want to discuss about this vaccine. And it's not what your brother thinks or your sister or your neighbor or your spouse or even your doctor. It's what you think. If you think it's something that you want to put into this VSafe app, then you put it in there. It's completely uncensored, unfiltered, and you do not have to request permission. So as of October 4th, and this slide needs to be updated. So as of October 4th, 167,000 pregnant women had registered with this VSafe app. So let's just think about that for a minute. When we think about the volume of these huge phase 3 trials, 112,000 people were enrolled in the Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson trials collectively, and pregnant women were excluded from these trials, 112,000 people. And now pregnant women, all of whom have either been vaccinated or were pregnant at the time of vaccination, now outnumber all 3 trials collectively where they were excluded, 167,000 women. When we look at the first 30,000 of those women who registered with that VSafe app and look at things like intrauterine growth retardation, pregnancy-induced hypertension, preeclampsia, eclampsia, spontaneous abortion, when that subcommittee of the CDC, the Committee on Immunization Practices, looked at those 30,000 women, it was determined that all of those incidences of a negative impact to the fetus occurred at a lower percentage in the women who had been vaccinated versus women in the general population who had never been vaccinated. That prompted the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, and the American Academy of Pediatrics to all come out to say, not only should pregnant women get immunized and get vaccinated, but women desiring to be pregnant should also get vaccinated. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology even went further to state that we understand that a pregnant woman is at high risk of complications from this virus should she be infected. Not only complications to the mother, but a risk of death to the baby. And we've seen that with this Delta variant at higher numbers than we ever thought imaginable. Because of that, because the risk in a pregnant state is so high, the risk benefit ratio just does not bear out when you are comparing the risk of getting COVID versus taking a vaccine to protect from hospitalizations, complications, and maybe even death of the baby. And we've also seen maternal deaths as well, deaths of the mother from the COVID virus. So this is where we are with pregnancy. The other thing that I will add that sometimes is asked is about male fertility, men. What do we know about men? Just in general, when you get this vaccine, you might get a fever. It's one of the common side effects: fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, headaches, these myalgias or body aches, injection site pain. But fever is one of the common side effects. If a man gets a fever, it lowers your sperm count, and it takes about 2 months for that sperm count to recover. But this is not just a fever from the vaccine. This is fever from any cause at any time in a man's life. So this is not a cause of the vaccine. This is a possible reaction to a possible side effect of the vaccine. Most vaccines have a probable side effect or a possible side effect of fever. But don't forget, if you were to get infected with COVID-19, you could develop a raging fever and also impact the sperm count. The other thing to think about is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, when it invades a man's body, and women as well, but when it invades a man's body, it binds to all receptors on all cells, and that includes the testicles. Whereas the COVID vaccine, the messenger RNA delivery, does not impact the testicles. So something to think about when we think about what pregnancy and fertility looks like. Chronic medical conditions. People often ask me, I have diabetes, I have asthma, I have seizures, I have cancer. I don't think I should take this vaccine. I'm worried that the vaccine is not safe. And that's actually the opposite of what you should be thinking. If you've got a chronic medical condition, hepatitis, HIV, high blood pressure, we want you to get these vaccines, and we want you to get them preferentially, meaning we want you to jump the line and be first. What do we know about chronic medical conditions? While they were not specifically studied in these trials, they also were not excluded. And chronic medical conditions of all types were included, including obesity. Almost 50% of all participants in 112,000 person trials were obese. So we definitely have a reflection of what this population looks like. In addition, we have patients who had high blood pressure. We had over 5,000 people with significant heart disease. We had people with significant lung disease, people with all forms of cancer, HIV, people positive with COVID, people with previous histories of COVID. Everybody is here. Nobody was excluded except the pregnant women. So this data that went to the FDA is relevant to people with chronic medical conditions. I am a cardiologist. If you have significant heart disease and you get infected with this SARS-CoV-2 virus and develop COVID-19, you are 6 times as likely to be admitted to the hospital than someone without significant heart disease who also contracts COVID. Once you are in the hospital, you are 12 times as likely to die, not survive that hospitalization, as someone else in the hospital with COVID who does not have significant heart disease. This is an incredible risk. It increases your risk. Chronic medical conditions decrease your reserve. That is why when we see the Pfizer vaccine now coming under FDA approval for special populations with chronic medical conditions, pregnancy is listed there because we know your immune system is weakened and you have less reserve during the pregnant state. So we absolutely want people with chronic medical conditions to get this vaccine. And if you're not sure if you have a chronic medical condition, if you take a prescription, medication, or inhaler, or use any type of device for any purpose on any regular interval, then that's you. You've got a chronic medical condition, and you should absolutely consider strongly getting vaccinated and getting protected. So I'm often asked about herd immunity. What really does herd immunity mean? What does that really mean? So herd immunity is a term that was developed really in farmers, really, at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 19th century. And farmers had cows, right? Cattle, herds. And what they noticed in their herds is when plagues came over the land, which is actually what COVID is. We call it a pandemic, but when you don't have treatment, it's a plague comes over the land. They noted that their cows that survived not only seemed to have long-lasting immunity, but cows that subsequently were purchased to fill out the herd and those that were subsequently born to the herd also seemed to have immunity, even though they hadn't been exposed to the plague. And they started to call that herd immunity. And they recognized that if they had a certain number of cows that had survived, They could bring in random cows from all over, and none of them would ever get sick. So human medicine adopted that term when we began to talk about diseases and infectious diseases, and we still call it herd immunity. It's literally from cattle farmers. And so, what does that mean? We have always had a slice of our population that is unvaccinated. These are generally people who are at high risk if they were to be vaccinated with our previous vaccines, which are live vaccines or attenuated, meaning they have been weakened, or sometimes they are killed, but they're all made from the live virus. Measles, mumps, rubella, these are all live viral vaccines. So if you have a weakened immune system, or you have leukemia, or you have cancer, these are the types of, or HIV, that if you get these vaccines in other people, they stimulate an immune response to protect you. But if you've got a weakened immune response, the vaccine could actually give you the disease and kill you. So we've always had a slice of our population that does not get vaccinated, but they remain healthy. Why? Because they're in the herd. And people like me and people like you are immunized. So viruses and plagues that may come upon us and look for humans can't find anyone, because we've got a shield of armor up. And so, because no one in society can be found to be a part of this life cycle of the virus dies out. And then those who are not immunized still benefit from that herd immunity. Don't forget, human beings for this SARS-CoV-2 virus are the key part of the life cycle of this virus. Without humans, the virus literally dies out. It must invade the human body such that it can replicate and then form these mutations, which are replication errors. That is why scientists urged everyone at the beginning of the pandemic. You may not remember this, but at the beginning of the pandemic, scientists told everyone, just shelter in place for 60 to 90 days. Because what did we know? We knew that if the virus literally cannot seek a human host, it would die. But as you see, a year and a half in, we could not do that. Within 2 weeks, we were yelling about different things, freedoms, and we needed to be out, and we could not do that. And the virus has continued to thrive. We had 2 or 3 other windows of opportunities as well to get this under control, and we squandered those as well. And so when we look at this herd immunity, we know that humans are a part of what this occurs, of what is required for this virus to live and to change. In science, survival goes to the fittest, Darwin's theory. But the fittest in science doesn't mean the strongest. The fittest means the most adaptable. The most adaptable species always survives. This virus, with its multiple mutations and variants, is quite fit. So it is a formidable foe, humans versus viruses, as we continue to try to survive the evolution of this virus. The last thing that I will say about herd immunity is I often hear people say, I never get vaccines, I'm anti-vax, or it's just not something I believe in, or my friend never gets vaccines and I do, and my friend is never sick, so I'm starting to think maybe I shouldn't get them. And so here's something to think about when you think about that. I've already explained herd immunity, but most of the times people who are not getting vaccines, I listen to them and they tout how healthy they are. Well, here's the deal. They're healthy not because they've achieved some specific level of mental elevation above the rest of us, or they've achieved a state of physical being that provides a suit of armor around them, or they found just the right cocktail of vitamins that they're taking every single day religiously. No, they are healthy because I got my vaccine and all the people around them get their vaccine. So they benefit and have good health because of my good health. So the irony in people who are asserting their independence and refusing the vaccine is that by being independent and refusing the vaccine, you actually are now dependent on me for your health. So this is how we encapsulate and think about herd immunity. Children are 25% of our population. We see that vaccines are, we call these bridging down studies, are getting to younger and younger and younger populations after we study them, after we have the safety data in adults. We expect on October 26th to look at the FDA and what they will be thinking regarding Pfizer doses for children ages 5 to 11. Children make up 25% of the population. Initially, we could get to herd immunity with 70% of our population being immunized. That was not a difficult task. But you see, here we are at 64%, and it's taken us so long until now we will have to achieve 85% to reach herd immunity because this virus has changed so often. So the main thing that we can do to protect our children is for us to be vaccinated such that our children can thrive within a safe environment. We know that children also develop long haul syndrome, these long lingering symptoms, even though by and large they do well. If they contract this virus, by and large, they're not hospitalized. They don't die. Now, certainly we've had many children die in this last surge. I do not want to minimize that. That was really unconscionable. But in comparison to adults and the elderly, children do better. It is not worth the risk of being exposed to the Delta variant, but they do better. However, even if they do well with this virus, you can develop these long lingering symptoms. And in children, long haul syndrome looks a little differently. It can be hallucinations or seizures or GI symptoms like upset stomach and vomiting and intestinal problems. These are symptoms that can prevent you from being successful in school. They interfere with your learning. They also contribute to absenteeism from school and can interfere with your ability to progress and be successful in life. So we want to take this seriously, make certain that you strongly consider, if you have children, being vaccinated and making certain that they are in areas where other people are taking it seriously and being vaccinated as well. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I thought I would just take a moment just to talk about it. You know, we had a big pause on the Johnson & Johnson. People consider it a third tier vaccine. And, you know, I didn't get the best one because I got Johnson & Johnson. So let me talk about this for a moment. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine came third to the market. So Pfizer was first, Moderna, and then Johnson & Johnson. When the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was being trialed, when they were running their trials, there were different variants circulating. You may remember there was the Alpha variant out of the UK. There was a Brazilian variant. There was a South African variant. When Moderna and Pfizer did their trials, since they were early, first and second, those variants did not exist in the environment. So they trialed their vaccine formulation in a different environment than the Johnson & Johnson. In fact, they trialed their formulation in an environment that was less strident than the Johnson & Johnson. There was less competition. The variants literally had not been created yet when Pfizer and Moderna were doing their trials. So when we look at the efficacy and we say Moderna's 94.5% efficacy, Pfizer's 95%, but Johnson & Johnson was only 72% in the United States. We have to remember that we're not comparing apples to oranges. We don't know how Moderna and Pfizer might have done if they had to um, run their trials within the same environment of all of the variants globally that Johnson and Johnson did. So we're not comparing apples to oranges. That's one thing. The second thing to think about is that in order to receive FDA consideration by a vaccine to go onto the market, you have to demonstrate at least 50% efficacy, 50%. That's the minimum. Our flu vaccine on any given year, by the way, is only between 45 and 65% efficacious. That's the best that we get out of the flu vaccine. The minimum for FDA approval is 50%. Johnson & Johnson, when it developed its formulation, had 72% efficacy. That really was astonishing. Remember, the bar is only 50. They had 72% efficacy with just their one shot. So they developed a single dose formulation. Moderna and Pfizer, with their one shot, only had a 35 to 45% efficacy, not enough to even be considered at the FDA. So they're forced to go to a 2-dose regimen to try to get their efficacy over 50%. We were all astonished and elated that with their 2-dose regimen, they got up into the 90 percentile. We had actually never seen that. But the reason they did that was because their single dose formulation wasn't potent enough to even receive FDA approval. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has a higher potency. Unfortunately for Johnson & Johnson, because Moderna and Pfizer were forced to do a 2-dose regimen, their efficacy ended up being higher. Does that mean Johnson & Johnson is worse? Not only is it not worse, it's a more potent vaccine, and it still created 100% protection from death and hospitalization, even though it was trialed in a more rigorous environment of variants than Moderna and Pfizer. Additionally, breakthrough infections that we have seen with this Delta variant as we study the state of Florida have mostly occurred in the Pfizer vaccine. What we know about that vaccine now that it has FDA approval is we see this waning effect, right? Over 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. And so people who receive their vaccines early have more of a waning effect later on. And that was independent of the Delta variant. So when we look at this Johnson & Johnson vaccine and they say this is a 3rd-tier vaccine because the numbers are all lower, don't forget, this is not math. This is science. 72% efficacy for Johnson & Johnson can be equal to 94 and 95% efficacy of Moderna and Pfizer with a 2-dose regimen versus a 1-dose regimen versus breakthrough infections. So think about that when you are thinking about what these vaccines mean, because the Johnson & Johnson formulation actually was the most potent formulation. We see that they have moved into a 2-dose formulation trial, and so we're waiting to see what will come for that. When this vaccine was paused, April 13th to April 23rd, it was because blood clots were being noted in this VAERS system, vaccine adverse event reporting system. We stopped it just to take a closer look at it. We did identify 15 women who had developed these CVSTs, cerebral venous sinus thromboses, these special types of blood clots. Only one of them was on birth control pills. And I know people asked about birth control pills. Only one person was on birth control pills. What we saw in these women is that they all were between the ages of 18 and 50, and the majority of them clustered between the ages of 34 and 40. So 18 and 50 were kind of outliers. Most of the occurrences were between the ages of 34 and 40. This occurred at a rate of 7 in 1 million. That is incredibly rare, very rare. 7 in 1 million. That is why Johnson & Johnson is now available once again on the market. And just to give you an idea of context, 7 in 1 million chance of developing this blood clot. If you are taking birth control pills, you have a chance of developing a blood clot that's 1 in 1,000. And we take those all the time. This is 7 in a million. If you are in a car accident, your chances of dying are 1 in 77. And here's another statistic. You are more likely to be admitted to an emergency room with a pogo stick injury than you are to develop a blood clot from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Last thing that I will say about them is that I don't want to minimize these blood clots. If you develop a blood clot, it's very serious. It's 100% treatable, but you must seek medical attention. You cannot stay at home. We have had no one die from the blood clots, but you must seek medical attention. I do not want to minimize that at all. Very serious side effect. It's very rare, but it does happen, happens in women, and generally the clusters are between the ages of 34 and 40. So where are we now? Native immunity, I think we've got a few minutes left. Native immunity versus vaccine immunity. People, I get this question all the time, so I thought I would take just a couple of minutes to talk about that. The Israeli study came out recently, a month ago, and in Israel, they looked at people who had received the vaccine versus people who had been infected and had natural immunity. And they noted that people who had received the vaccine were hospitalized 27 times more often than people who had never received the vaccine. And so that, set off a treasure trove of all types of controversy. A couple of things I will say is I do something called the Stairwell Chronicles, where I literally sit on the steps and I talk to you and I answer questions about COVID and the COVID vaccine in 60 seconds or less, just little snippets. And I discussed this in one of those Stairwell Chronicles. So if you get a chance to look at it, I am on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram at Dr. Jayne Morgan, DrJayneMorgan. And I talk about herd immunity, native immunity, vaccine immunity in 60 seconds or less. So I want to first refer you to there so you have more information to get. The reason I'm bringing up the Stairwell Chronicles is because I do one specifically talking and urging people to please stop doing your own research. Because when you do your own research, oftentimes you don't have the background to understand what you're really reading. And this is a great example. This Israeli study was an observational study. That sounds pretty important, doesn't it? But literally in science, it means this data is not reproducible. And remember, I talked earlier in the talk about blinding patients and blinding doctors, this double-blind randomized controlled trials. That's the gold standard to not introduce bias and to get clean data. That's the gold standard. Observational literally means that it's unlikely that you can reproduce it. So if you're really conducting a science trial at the highest degree of integrity, whatever you do in Israel, I should be able to reproduce that study in Georgia. They should be able to do the same thing in Brazil. They should be able to do the same thing in China. It should go to England. They should be able to get the exact same results. These are reproducible results from blinded trials. This would not be reproducible. The other thing is they use the word study. It's a study. It's not a trial. These are all indicators for a scientist when they're reading it that, the results might be anything. So what I want to talk about with this is herd immunity. Back to herd immunity. I get asked all the time, can't we reach herd immunity without getting vaccinated? And the answer to that is, of course we can. Plagues have come across the land for centuries. We absolutely can. But in doing so, we have to be able to accept a certain amount of death. Long-term immunity only goes to the survivors. People who die don't get the immunity. So as long as we can accept death, we can absolutely get to herd immunity. The vaccines offer an opportunity to reach herd immunity for even the most vulnerable in our population and mitigate death. So when we look at this Israeli study, and they looked at these two populations, a population that had been infected and a population that had been immunized, and the population that had been immunized was hospitalized more often. What they didn't tell you, but is inherent in science, but would not have been apparent to a non-scientific reader, is that that group of people who had been infected and not immunized and seemingly was healthy was a survivor group. They are the ones who are remaining. The ones who have died are not around to be counted. So that's the first thing. This is a group of survivors. So we're unable to count those who did not survive. The second thing is they only looked at people in January and February, early on when we were given the vaccines. And I've already alluded to what we learned about the Pfizer vaccine is that immunity wanes over time, meaning it diminishes. We see it drop after 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, still pretty high. But Pfizer's vaccine efficacy went from 95% to 91% at 6 months. And that was prior to the Delta variant. We know the Delta variant challenged our vaccines even further. So when we look at these studies, we need to know what we're talking about when we're doing our own research, because you can draw any conclusion from an observational study and it's unable to be challenged because you stated it's observational. So you know we can't reproduce it. And these groups, these cohorts were not comparable. Side effects of the vaccine, I often get those. So I've gone over some of the common ones. I talked about Johnson & Johnson with the blood clots. The other side effect of Johnson & Johnson is something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurologic syndrome. It's very rare. It's incredibly rare with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It did have to be listed because it met the criteria. There was one additional case of Guillain-Barré in the active arm, the group that actually got the vaccine, than in the placebo, the number one. So even that meets the criteria. You have to list it. Very rare. The other one that I hear people ask me about is myocarditis. Myocarditis, this inflammation of the heart that I hear with the messenger RNA vaccine, Moderna and Pfizer. Why would I take a vaccine if I get this risk of myocarditis? So here's my answer to that. Myocarditis is an inflammation or a swelling of the heart. This myocarditis side effect is occurring with the messenger RNA vaccines, and it occurs mostly in men, young men, 35 years of age or younger. It occurs at a rate of about 67 per million. And so what I have people ask me is, why would I even take that risk of 67 per million when I don't have any risk out here in the general population? So first of all, that statement is incorrect. You do have some risk, but let's just say you have no risk. Once again, you're not comparing the right groups. We're not comparing a vaccinated group to people in the general population who are healthy. We are comparing a vaccinated group to those who get infected with the virus. That's what the vaccines are there to do, to protect you from the virus. And when we look at those groups, if you get infected with COVID, your risk of developing myocarditis is 450 in a million versus the vaccine, which is 67 in 1 million after the second dose and 77 in 1 million if you also include the first dose. Those are the right groups or cohorts to compare. Again, I urge you to not do your own research, but talk with people who can help you think through this. The last thing that I will end with is variants and mutations. People, often ask me about this. You may not have noticed, that we now talk about variants. At the beginning of this pandemic, we were talking about mutations, right? But now we're talking about variants. And that just seems innocuous to people, but it is not. That is a very specific language that denotes an escalation in science. What is the difference? A variant is actually a cluster of several mutations that have all come together to form a new version of the original virus. So this Delta variant is not the same version of the original virus. Scientists know this. That's why we urge everyone to just shelter in place, because what do viruses do? They replicate and mutate. This Delta variant has a viral load 1,200 times higher than the previous variants. Because of that, Dr. Walensky originally said that people who were vaccinated could remove their masks because we knew that you weren't a danger to yourself or to others, but the Delta variant changed the game. You were still less likely to be sick, but breakthrough infections were occurring. And because that viral load was so high, you had so many viral particles, you did have the opportunity to spread it to others, not to the degree of someone who's unimmunized, but it was not zero. So even the immunized had to go back under mask because of this mutation and its development. This fourth surge was the highest surge that we've seen. Doctors are exhausted. Nurses are exhausted. We've been on the front lines forever. The fourth surge was also characterized by misinformation, maybe a surge in misinformation, and somewhat of compassion fatigue of physicians and staff as people come into the facility. This is our first surge that was entirely preventable when we had vaccines readily available. And yet people still came to the hospital, and the doctors and medical staff have to risk their lives to come in contact with people with infectious agents, and then also have to go home to their families, not knowing what they may take home to their families in a pandemic, in a fourth surge that was preventable, and people refused to get vaccines, but came to the hospital to expose the staff when they were sick. And we've seen a lot of depression and despondency and mental health issues in our staff throughout the United States because of this dichotomy that we've had to manage within our system. This last pandemic was a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So I will stop there. I will just say, you can follow me. I'm on Twitter. I've got my own YouTube channel. I'm on, Instagram and also LinkedIn. So if you see me on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, it's at Dr. Jayne Morgan. And I do Stairwell Chronicles. I've probably done 70 or 80 of them, all kinds of COVID topics. Pick the one that you like. Listen to me talk for 60 seconds. It's just one little leaf. You put on a branch. Next time you come back, get another leaf, put it on the branch, and make sure that you're getting sound science at all times and not in a social media rabbit hole. You know how social media works. If you're thinking something and you click on it and it gives you all kinds of misinformation about it that sounds good to you, now the algorithm feeds you more of the same. And now it connects you with people who it's feeding. And down this rabbit hole you go, right? And it starts out with a few of you. And what do rabbits do? Rabbits reproduce quickly. Next thing you know, there are thousands of you all running around in that rabbit hole. Come out into the light and follow people who are following science, who don't have a political agenda, who are just talking to you about the science. So I will close there. This is an example of my Stairwell Chronicles. You'll see my images, and you'll see the questions or the topic here. I never take vaccines, and I'm always healthy. Listen to me talk about it for 60 seconds. Boosters and the immunocompromised. Listen to me talk about it for 60 seconds. Now that I'm fully vaccinated, can I transmit COVID to others? Listen to me talk about it for 60 seconds. If you don't like what I've said, it's only 1 minute of your time, right? You can't be that mad about me. I've only wasted a minute of your life. So 60 seconds. I appreciate being invited today, and I hope everybody has a great homecoming.
Dr. Morgan, thank you so much. Thank you on many fronts. Thank you for giving us this tree of knowledge with all of these precious leaves of information. Thank you for your sacrifice and all of those in the medical field. We have many alumni that are on the forefront, so we thank you, and we're elated that you are not just in Atlanta, but definitely representing Atlanta, but being on several stages sharing this information to the masses. We had a couple of questions. I think we're only going to be able to get to one, but I'm sure some of these others may have been answered in your Stairwell Chronicles. If they haven't, if you don't mind, we can forward them to you, and maybe you would, give a Stairwell Chronicle on one of these questions. But one of the things that's kind of new in the news,
me all the time, and I will create a Stairwell Chronicle because if you have the question, other people do as well. So happy to do that.
So one of the main ones coming up in the news, and very important to me as well, for the vaccine that's being created for those children ages, 5 to 11? If there's any light you want to shed on that, that was our first question.
Right. So that's the Pfizer vaccine. We will see on October 26th what the FDA and CDC think about that. I probably will sit in on those. I usually go to most of them as a silent observer just to listen to the discussion and the presentations. So we will see, but I think we can probably expect that it will move forward and be available in some form, hopefully by November, but October 26th is the date.
Okay, and then just one other really quick one about masking. Is double masking still recommended, and what is the best type of mask to be using?
Yeah, so double masking. So let me just start with double masking. Double masking is not recommended except if you're in a specific high risk category. So you're a cancer patient taking chemotherapy and you live in an area with a high prevalence of disease like Georgia or somewhere else in the Southeast. So you've got to think about what you're doing, have some situational awareness, right? If you are at home, no, this obviously is when you're out in public. We absolutely want you to get vaccinated. That's number one. But generally, double masking is not required unless you are gauging that you are really going into a high risk situation. And absolutely, if you're not vaccinated. The other thing to think about is the N95 masks are the absolute gold standard. K95 is good. If you can't get one of those, a 3-ply surgical mask, with the 3 layers is also very good. The cloth masks are the worst. The heavier the cloth, the better. The thinner, the worse. So the cloth masks are generally not recommended at all unless you're using it as a layer on top of, your 3-ply mask. But the best thing is to get immunized and then wear a single mask. But if you're in a high risk group, consider double masking.
Well, thank you so much. We'll get these other questions to you. I know that you have several other speaking engagements today, and we just appreciate you being the voice and just sharing this scientific knowledge, which is very important to us remaining safe and healthy and alive. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
All right. So for all of our alum, don't log off just yet. Please remain in the session for a special message from one of our students, Devin Stoling.
Happy homecoming, Spelman sisters. I am Devin Stoling, a junior health science major from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I serve as Secretary of Institutional Advancement in the 80th Spelman Student Government Association Administration. This homecoming, I'm celebrating Spelman, and I'm so appreciative of the sisters that I have gained when I first stepped through the Spelman gates, and my other sisters that I have gained during my journey here at Spelman. We miss seeing your faces this year, but you can still make an impact on campus this homecoming. Supporting Spelman Strong will fortify the college's foundation and ensure our financial stability. In honor of the college's 140th anniversary, this past Founders Day, Spelman renamed our annual fund to reflect the enduring nature of our legacy, Spelman Strong. This unrestricted fund is critical to the success of numerous essential programs across the college as we fill any gaps that may arise between our expenses and tuition revenue, and goes towards the greatest areas of need for students and faculty. Your donations keep me Spelman strong by giving me memorable experiences during my time here at Spelman, opportunities that enhance my education and also prepare me to step out in the real world as a Black educated woman. Please consider making a gift to Spelman Strong in honor of homecoming. And the amount you choose to donate will make a difference. We thank you in advance, and we hope you enjoy our virtual homecoming.
Thank you, Devin, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. Please return at 8:30 p.m. to the AirMeet platform for our Spellcella Homecoming Edition. We look forward to seeing you there. And just a reminder, if you missed any of the sessions that took place between last Sunday and now, you can log on to the AirMeet platform to view those previously recorded activities. All right, we look forward to seeing you tonight and for the rest of homecoming.